So we'll go ahead and get started. I have a handout because I love a handout. So I'm talking about social media and pedagogy. I'm going to mainly talk about Twitter because that's the one that I use, although my students often incorporate a variety of different social media. So I can talk to the uses and pros and cons of those as well. But I figure if I talk about one, I can you can extrapolate some of that to other things. So my plan is to kind of walk us through the assignment sheet and then kind of show you some examples. I have examples of syllabi, and then I have some examples of assignment sheets that are specifically for Twitter, but also some assignment sheets that show ways you can thread social media throughout all of your projects as opposed to just using it as an assignment or a one-time kind of thing. So first, I like to always think about when Jen O'Malley did her dissertation here. My class was one of the courses she studied because she was studying the social in the classroom. And the first day she came to observe my class, she was in a slight state of panic. And she presented about it with me at the WPA, not this past summer, but the summer before, and she started with, I didn't understand what was happening. She introduced me, she being me, and then she said, then she got out her phone. I didn't understand why she got out her phone. Because a lot of times people put a kind of negative spin on technology in the classroom, whether it is trying to police the use of technology, not allowing phones, laptops, iPads, things like that into the classroom. And I get it. They are a distraction. However, they can be put to a good use because I kind of see it as if we're not going to talk about how to use these things in a productive manner. How are our students going to learn how to use it productively? Often they negotiate digital spaces all the time, but they're not thinking about how they're doing it. So the why behind this approach using Twitter, I've been using it in the classroom for 3 years at this point, was really completely rooted in the topic of my ENC 1145, which was writing about gossip and gender. So I was looking at all the different ways in which gossip spreads through society to incorporate them into my class. So at that point it was like, this sounds like a really fun idea. Everyone, I'm going to use Twitter and just see what happens. But then, obviously, I needed a slightly better rationale to explain to my students, to explain to Dr. Teague. And so I was thinking about ways we can balance professional and personal, right? People talk about digital spaces, especially like Facebook and Twitter, as these people, they don't understand their boundaries, right? When I introduce Twitter in the classroom, I always talk about how Twitter's not just for duck-faced drunk pictures anymore. Because it's not, right? And we know that if you have any social media accounts, we know that we meet in the FSU grad group to talk about pedagogy, to talk about issues pertaining to what we do here. But if you ever look on Twitter, there's hashtags where they have digital chats. Heather is a part of the Digital Rhetoric Collaborative, and they hold hashtag chats on Twitter about pedagogy, about other forms of digital rhetorics. You can follow scholars. Students have the opportunity to interact with the people they're reading in a digital space. For me, the idea of a network where you're networking not just within the class, but you're networking outside of the class, and circulation. How does information circulate in this digital space? How do we circulate that information? How can we help that circulation happen? Obviously, a big thing for me is audience awareness. Who is reading what you're saying? Why are they reading it? Why are you asking them to read it? The publicness of writing, if you go back to Dr. Yancey's 4C's address in 2004, she talks about the public nature of writing. More people are writing than ever before, and that's not any less true now, 10 years later. So what does that do to that kind of notion of writing? How does it change? Obviously, rhetorical purpose. Why are you saying what are you saying? That's just as important as what you have to say. Rhetorical situation. You don't always study this in like as a specific component of your class, but when I teach FYC and our major courses in the EWM major, we read the rhetorical situations. So then we're kind of using that as a base to talk about how people interact in those spaces. And the last one is digital literacies. Our students are what are deemed digital natives. But like I said earlier, they're not necessarily aware of how they're using it. There's a huge difference between being able to just navigate it for fun, go look at cat pictures, go look at a BuzzFeed list, and then using it for conversation, getting information to other people, thinking about the difference between producing and consuming in that space, right? So literacy does not just mean being able to read, and it also means being able to write. And so in digital spaces, it means being able to read those texts as well, understanding how to communicate in that space. So for me, we're gonna kind of scroll down, I'll scroll down the computer, I suppose. The how. Students often have more pushback than you're gonna expect with social media. One, they've probably had a terrible experience on Twitter, and they have sworn it off because in high school, all the drama happened on Twitter, and they had to experience the notion of subtweeting and all of these terrible things where they're like talking about you, but you don't know they're talking about you, right? And it's just a mess. So sometimes you have to be like, but look at all these great things we can do with it. So one way to do that is to have really clear parameters. What your expectation is, whether that's how many tweets they use per week, how many tweets they hashtag. We'll get to that in a minute, but I use class hashtags. So there's a certain number of tweets per week that students have to use the hashtag. For me, it's easy cataloging. For them, it gives them a sense of purpose for those tweets. I model my use of Twitter. I don't just ask my students to tweet and then kind of explore what they have to say. I'm tweeting with them. I'm not always a huge fan of using models in the classroom, especially in terms of like writing assignments, because then you get cookie cutter papers back. So if somebody says, can you give me an example of a research paper? I'm like, no, I cannot. But we can talk about the components that you need to do. In Twitter, however, you can have that modeling aspect because they can't just keep repeating your tweets. And so then they're kind of seeing how you use that space. For instance, it's down here on some of the questions, but the idea of creating a separate account for Twitter. I have one Twitter account. I used to have two. When I first started tweeting, I was like, I need to keep this private Twitter and have this professional Twitter. That was entirely too much work. Also, my private Twitter wasn't private, so they obviously could find it if they wanted to. So instead, I started modeling this idea of balance between professional and personal. My students see pictures of my cats, they see pictures of the food that I cook, but they also see me tweeting about my dissertation, tweeting quotes from scholarship that I'm reading, tweeting at them about quotes from texts that they're reading. So there's this balance, right? Some of you have probably seen when I live tweet when I'm at conferences. I live tweet at 4Cs. I did it at IWCA when I was there in October. And then when we read Adam Banks' book last spring, I live tweeted some of our conversations, and he actually kind of got in on that conversation. So there's an example for my students to see, wow, sometimes scholars respond. They don't always, and that's very upsetting. Clay Shirky does not like to respond, and we read him in WeBo, and I always try to tweet at him. He never responds. But sometimes I do. Then, in terms of ways you can implement it, it works as a great discussion tool. You can post questions to students there. They can respond to those questions. You can have students post the questions and then respond to each other. You can even use it as a drafting tool. If you're having trouble getting students to have a concise thesis statement, for instance, you can have them tweet drafts of a thesis statement, because in a tweet you have 140 characters. That's not very many words. So it's making them think carefully about word choice, it's making them think about audience, it's making them think about purpose. And so then they can workshop on Twitter. They can give each other feedback, they can reply, they can retweet, they can have conversation with you. I have taught with Twitter in both a CWC, a computer writing classroom, and a traditional classroom. In fact, the first time I ever taught with Twitter, I was in a traditional classroom for the first time in my teaching career. And I was like, how did this happen to me? I am using all of this technology. I'm asking my students to use all of this technology, and I have just this projector. Students have technology of some sort, especially at this particular university. I wouldn't say that across lots of campuses they do. At my previous institution, I had first-generation college students from places that didn't have the internet. And so the kinds of technology they had access to and the kinds of technology they brought to the classroom were very different. But especially in this particular atmosphere, students in that first class of Gossip and Gender, they did start bringing their laptops or their tablets, but it started with phones. So they would live tweet class, which wasn't a requirement at that point. There was like a whole log of everything that happened that day. And I was like, oh, this is great. People can see, you know, you don't get that email that said, what did I miss in class? There's a whole Twitter feed. Check that first and then get back to me. And so that became like a requirement later on for me. So if we're thinking about who can do this, it really is useful in any teaching setting. It's useful for us as budding scholars in our fields, whether it's creative writing, literature, rhetoric, and composition. It's a space for us to create a professional identity. It's a space for first-year writing. It's a space for upper-level courses. Doesn't matter. Faculty have started using it. It always amuses me when all of a sudden, not too long ago, Dr. Neal followed me and he followed the Twitter for the digital studio, and then I was like, oh, now one of the people who I come in contact with a lot is following me. He sees what I have to say, and then I was like, oh, that's how my students feel, right? That's how they feel when they're like, I just tweeted about something that's not about class. That was the first realization that was most amusing, is that they didn't believe I was going to actually look at their tweets. I'm like, no, I see them. The first time I ever pulled them up on the screen in class, there was major panic. So this is from my FSU Weibo class. This is from discussions today. We talked about invitational rhetoric today, and the difference between traditional rhetoric and invitational rhetoric. They had a lot of feels about that, it turns out. But as you can see, here is a hashtag. So I typed in the hashtag in the search bar, and then pulled up all the tweets. If I go far enough back, I can get every FSU WePo tweet that's ever happened. I've used this hashtag for 3 classes of FSU WePo. So spring 2014, summer 2014, and fall. So the hashtag for me is really useful because it also creates a conversation across populations of students. My past students often are still following me and checking out that hashtag, especially when I taught FSU Gossip and Gender. People would jump into the conversation from 2 semesters ago. And they're like, hey, what's going on? Here's something, I remember reading that, or here's a quote to think about from that text. And I was like, we're just creating a whole new space of community. So if you're thinking about what kind of social media or what platform you might want to use, I have a few listed. Twitter, obviously, but it is some of the characteristics of that particular platform. You've got 140 characters. There's a hashtag. You can use hashtags, and we can talk about what a hashtag is here in a second if you would like a brief description. You can set up lists, which I found to be particularly useful when you are trying to get your students to follow each other. I think I have 7 lists now. And I put my students on them so that they can find each other, because then you don't know that they're always following each other. So I have them, in terms of implementing Twitter, I get them to create their accounts or to go ahead and follow me with their existing account, which they have free reign over whatever they want to do. But we talk about some of the implications of choosing to create a different Twitter. Based on my own experience, I'm like, but remember, you have to keep tweeting and remembering to switch back and forth. Also, what about your professional and personal balance? So I create these lists and then put them on it so that they can find each other, and so that I can make sure I have everybody from class, because every so often, somebody maybe just never added you, and then you realize you can't grade them at the end of the semester if you don't have their Twitter handle, which is their Twitter name. Things you can do on Twitter: you can favorite things, obviously you can tweet, you can reply to others, and you can retweet them. My students are allowed to do retweets, replies, and tweets for credit. You're not allowed to do all of your tweets for the week as a retweet, but sometimes retweeting someone is just as useful as typing it out yourself. And so we talk about ways to find that balance as well. I've had students, especially in some of the assignments that are listed on the left-hand side of your handout, they use Pinterest. They create pins and boards for their projects. Lots of students engage Tumblr, especially for viral campaigns, whether it was in an FYC class. I'm going to pull up the viral campaign assignments here in a few minutes. Or just a way, some of them keep notes in very interesting spaces that include social media, it turns out. This summer was the first time I had any students use Vine. I know Joe Serio does or at least he used to do a revision activity on Vine. He presented on it last fall at a 21st century Literacies workshop that was held here. So you can use them all in very different ways, but the Vine is a 6-second video. Like we did it with the National Day on Writing, that was what was hosted here at the studio. That really asks students to be very specific in similar ways, if not more specific than the Twitter and using a tweet for, say, a thesis statement practice or things like that. YouTube is a community, but it is technically a space that you could view as a social media platform. We've been using YouTube for so much longer that we don't necessarily think of it in terms of a community in the same way we think about conversations happening scrolling down your news feed or scrolling down your Twitter feed. But I've had students use it in very interesting ways because you still want to get views, and you still want to get shares, and you still want to get all of those things, right? And then Facebook. A lot of my students tell me that Facebook is going out of vogue, and they're not wrong. But some of my students right now that are doing their viral campaign, their Facebook is getting the most circulation. It's not just having your Facebook account. You can create pages, you can create groups, and you can have administrative roles, and it teaches students also how to delegate in those spaces. And then you can think about how circulation works in that space. Instagram is the one that I find students get the most viralness out of if they're doing a campaign project, trying to get followers, things like that. It's the easiest. I think that's because it's the most popular right now, it seems, because most popular in terms of still connected to your identity. There's all of those things like Yik Yak and Whisper right now where it's anonymous. But on Instagram, when you're posting a project and trying to garner a lot of interest, using hashtags very similarly to the way you use Twitter, hashtags and things like that have really proven particularly useful. Like I've gotten students get like 500 followers for a project on Instagram. Here I have listed some of the hashtags I have used in the past or currently. So as often as I remember, I actually use the hashtag Teach with Twitter because in my head one day there's an article coming from this, and I'll have a list of tweets that I've used. Sometimes it's when there's a really great teaching moment, I hashtag it, things like that. And my recommendation to you is if you use a social media platform, figure out a hashtag that will help you collect what your students have to do. Because the hashtag is a cataloging system. If you've never used it, that's why it's there. It helps you get connected to people who are also doing the things that you do. So often I will also hashtag FSU if I'm doing things connected to the campus. Last week, my hashtag was in the
Trending.
Thank you. Was trending. It trended for like 3 days, and it was like in the top 10 or higher for like several hours at a time. That was also when Kim Kardashian broke the internet, you guys. So like my hashtag in this area was trending, and I was like, yes. It's only ever happened one other time. It happened in Gossip and Gender, the first year that I taught Gossip and Gender. And so then you think about how many other people are reading what you're talking about, which kind of connects to some of the unexpected outcomes for me. The second time I taught with Twitter, I had half a class of student athletes, and they were from multiple sports, but some of them had 5,000 followers, right? These are 18-year-old students. They were freshmen and had 5,000 followers. And we were tweeting about feminism. And so it really brought another important thing to me in terms of how many people see what these kids, quote unquote, or students are tweeting about. And it became so much more important to me to talk about audience awareness. I mean, I've dealt with some really terrible hashtags. And that connects to what happens when somebody violates the civility clause in a digital space. You deal with it exactly the same as you set forth in your civility clause on your syllabus. My civility clause is giant because I talk about in the classroom, but I also talk about in digital spaces. And we can see that here in a second when I pull up a syllabus for you. But what happens is students often, if you'll think about, students get locked out. If they have lots of student athletes across different campuses, when it's their season, they're not allowed to use social media because of what might happen on social media. So then that speaks to my idea of rhetorical purpose, publicness of writing, awareness of audience, right? So yeah, I can't police what they're going to tweet when they're not inside class, especially if they're not using the class hashtag. But I've had students tweet about really terrible things across the room to each other, and we had to deal with it. And so thinking about, they'll never tweet like that again, because that's just, they were like, oh. Because often if you ask, lots of the student athletes that I've ever had, because especially in FYC, I taught student athletes a lot. I worked really well with the advisors and things like that. But they tell you they're a role model. They feel like they are a role model, especially if they've worked really hard to get here, which they all have. They see themselves as role models, but they don't necessarily always play out in digital spaces that way. And so then it creates an opportunity to talk about audience awareness. Who sees what you're tweeting? What are you tweeting, right? That's going to affect your potential in the NFL or the NBA or the baseball.
MLB.
Thanks. So thinking about that was really helpful to me in rationalizing and explaining why Twitter has become like completely ingrained in all of my pedagogy, and for that matter in positioning myself as a scholar, budding scholar, as it were, in the field, because I know that people who are doing what I do are out there and tweeting about it. I've had several occasions where at 4Cs this past spring, I met somebody who was my Twitter friend. We connected on Twitter because she and I had very similar research interests. Same thing, I finally met somebody who teaches at North Georgia. I met him at IWCA, and we had been Twitter friends probably for 6 months based on research interests alone. And so that also allows me to be like, look, you guys, here's a networking opportunity. These are people that I don't know. I've never met them, but they saw things I was tweeting about and got in contact with me. And so it works. In terms of assignments, I'm going to awkwardly twist around. I have a couple pulled up here. So first, when I assigned Twitter as an assignment, this was from the summer, so we can look at it later if you want, but this was an extra credit opportunity because I was like, I don't have time to implement Twitter in a 6-week summer class, and then like the night before I was like, I wish I had made Twitter a requirement. So I made it extra credit in the summer, that particular summer. Yes. So this is my current Twitter assignment sheet, if you will. And well, I can kind of talk you through it. It has shifted and changed as I've encountered potential problems and things like that. In the last probably 45 or 30 minutes of the workshop, you guys are going to have an opportunity to kind of start drafting materials that you might include in that syllabus or as an assignment sheet for, I guess, maybe spring semester or maybe even later down the road. So I talk about very clear parameters, right? So in this particular class, they're supposed to tweet 15 times per week. I tweet a lot, and so 15 is really not that many. They seem to think that it is, but they found very quickly that it's not. But of those 15, 10 of them must be hashtagged. When you create a hashtag, you want to think about making it as small as possible because, again, you only have 140 characters. And if you dedicate that to a giant long hashtag, it's really hard to achieve the content students might be wishing to achieve. I also do the hashtag component so that if students are using their personal Twitter, I can easily find the tweets that they're actually connecting to class. Because one time, the first time I taught it, I had a student who I think she tweeted over the semester, I think she tweeted like 2,000 times. So she's tweeting constantly, like live tweeting her life. And had I not had the hashtag, I would have never been able to count tweets. And for me, that's still something I'm working on, ways to assess it, ways to most efficiently assess the number of tweets students are achieving. I still count them, and so that's a little bit time consuming, but it's the method I've found that works the best at this point. I set out goals, right? So we talk about the why behind it, the notion of public, the notion of balance, things like that. Depending on what class I'm teaching, obviously your tweets are going to have something to do with that. But those tweets can have something to do with that in a variety of ways, right? It's not like you need to be tweeting quotes from your rhetoric textbook every time you tweet. You could be seeing some sort of rhetoric in action. You could be seeing composition in action. You could be seeing some sort of blatant abuse of rhetorical appeals if you're teaching FYC and are doing, say, a rhetorical analysis. Students can start noticing those things around them. Twitter is something that can be potentially engaged whenever, wherever they want. And so while you can be tweeting during class, it's sort of like an ongoing homework assignment. Twitter's just there, and you sort of engage it when it really surfaces as a valuable time for you. Then I talk about the very specific requirements, because if you don't give them some sort of specific requirement, which you know as teachers, you have a variety of investment, things like that, but if you can get them on board, they're going to play your game. They're going to figure out ways to use Twitter. They're going to be really interested in what it is you're going to do there. But because Twitter is so public, you've got to give them some direction. You can't just be like, okay, everyone go tweet and see what happens, right? Because then you're like, oh, look what happened. Whoops. So this is an example of a potential strictly focusing on Twitter. Yeah, so here I even have no more than 5 tweets per week can be retweets. Because sometimes people make really good claims. We do a lot of discussion on Twitter in my particular class, and retweeting each other also shows that you're a participant in the community. And then I make my little point about good news, if you're absent, you can still tweet probably unless you're like dying. You could probably have your phone within like a 2-foot radius of your body, and you can probably hop on Twitter, which a lot of my students do. Even if they're not in class, they're completely engaged in the Twitter conversation. But if they aren't able to be there, then they can just go to that hashtag and kind of filter through. The second time I started teaching with Twitter, I included the component of live tweeting. Every student is responsible for live tweeting 1 day out of the semester. Since everybody has to do it, I essentially just put people on a day. Or they just put their name on a day. But I mean, it's not like if you wait till the end of the semester, it's going to be easier. So that gives us a store of what happened. And those are all hashtagged. Often there's pictures from class, a video from class, quotes. My students really like to quote me. Sometimes I say really ridiculous things, and then other times I'm shocked when I go back and look at the hashtag at like this really great piece of information I shared with people. So it also helps you think about how you interact with your students, the kinds of things you're saying to your students, and how you're saying them. If you're working towards sort of a collaborative learning space, you're kind of negotiating that space between a traditional classroom where you're up at the front, there's a podium, but that doesn't really jive with your pedagogy. Twitter kind of helps distribute some of that authority in really interesting ways as well. And also, I'm a big fan of using memes on my assignment sheets, as you will quickly notice. So each of my assignments, I was talking about the idea of threading Twitter throughout. There's a caveat at the end of each of my assignment sheets of how Twitter might play a role in this. That kind of speaks to the idea of workshopping or drafting. This particular project was a remix or remediation project. And so they could tweet pictures of something that's in progress. They could tweet a version of a video and get some views. Had a lot of students really engage this particular component of this project. I had a student, she was creating a shirt for the project that they were working on, and she was tweeting out versions of this shirt to get feedback from her group. Do you think this color works better? Which way? You know, how does that work? If you happen to do I also sometimes do a project called oh man, it's a print text project, but it's a keyword project, and so defining a keyword within the major. And they could send out drafts of that definition to the public at large. People might be like, that is a crazy definition of that word, try again. They might also be like, oh, I've never thought of that term in this way. And so they end up having conversations on the back channel. And for me, that was a really eye-opening experience because this particular semester, my students are much more interested in tweeting when they haven't been told to tweet. So, like, we have discussion in class, but when I would ask them to have questions and discussion on Twitter, then they'd be like, yeah, but we already did that on Twitter. Why are you asking us to talk out loud too? Whereas if I don't tell them to tweet about what they're talking about at their tables before we come full group, there are way more tweets about the discussion, which I find fascinating because all of my other classes had been way more interested in having the tweets directed and then still conversing in class as well. But you can see how sometimes a student who's not real interested in telling you they don't really like this subject, they're going to tell you about that on Twitter. And they're going to be like, I don't really agree with this. And then that gives you an opportunity and other people in the classroom to be like, well, have you thought about it this way? Or maybe think in terms of this. We recently read an article about the Guerrilla Girls in my class, and one of my students was very upset that the negative effects the Guerrilla Girls were dealing with on women were not being represented in how they also affect men. And so for me, I'm like, yes, but patriarchy, right? But one of my students, before I could really even start that conversation, well, have you thought about this, right? One of my other students was like, yes, but. And so then they had a really great conversation thread that was like 6 tweets long, where they were negotiating that conversation and disagreeing with each other, but acknowledging that both sides had a valid space, which I thought was really well-informed for students to be able to have that practice and understand the difference between trolling somebody on Twitter and then actually engaging in conversation. So we also talk about trolling on Twitter. We talk about how activism works in Twitter spaces. This semester we got a lot of conversation happening about the Reset the Search hashtag, because as an in-class activity that was happening at the very beginning of the semester. We started looking at hashtags to research and learning about rhetorical situation of the hashtag, because there's lots of conversations happening about both sides of whatever a hashtag is about. And so one, it informed the students of what was actually going on campus at that exact moment, but it wasn't me being like, obviously we should reset the search, you guys. This is a terrible thing. It was me being like, here is a conversation that is happening. What do you think about it? And then those students are still engaged in that conversation. They followed it. They have varying opinions about what's going on and what went on with all the hiring, but they became involved in a campus-wide conversation, which I was not expecting, because we were really just talking about exigence and rhetorical situations. And then they were like, but this is important. And I'm like, yes it is, good job. So that's something you can do, right? If you're talking about, audience awareness, you could select a hashtag. How are people talking about this? Sometimes I have students search terms that we're using in class as hashtags, and like they'll search, so that often in my class there'll be like a multimodality hashtag, a digital hashtag, and then a rhetoric one often, and it brings in all kinds of people, right? All kinds of perspectives, and it helps them think about the facets of a definition and the facets of a term. Another thing that I do is in my, there's something new in Google Drive. Early in the semester, I have students read a very short article that's about digital tools in the classroom. This is specifically in terms of high school, but a lot of our students high school is pretty close in their mind. They remember it. It wasn't a long time ago. And so thinking about how technology was viewed when they were in high school, most of the time it was not allowed. No phones, no Facebook. You couldn't go to certain websites because it was on lockdown in the particular classroom. But then thinking about how they could use it, because that's at the beginning of the semester. Most of them have had some sort of terrible experience on a social platform. And so thinking about it within the context of the classroom is helpful. And I can, of course, send you some links to that, or any of these assignment sheets if you're interested in having different models to go from, ways to incorporate it. So I think something I would like to do now, I have all kinds of other things I could tell you about in terms of teaching with social media and teaching with Twitter and things like that, but I would actually like to know what some of your questions are so that I can help you successfully implement it in your classroom. So what are some questions, either questions I've touched on briefly that you'd like me to go back to, or just some burning questions about engaging it, whether it's just a step-by-step, this is how you use Twitter, or a more theoretical question?
Well, I know you assign Twitter things, so they have to tweet a certain number of times. Have you ever used it as just a suggested thing, where it's not required, it's not graded at all, but it's just, I suggest and I encourage you to follow me and to tweet about X stuff?
I guess when I did that summer class, where it was posed as an extra credit opportunity. So we didn't spend a lot of time using it in class, but people used it. Whether they were worried they were going to get a bad grade, the Twitter helped. And in that particular class, it was 1102, but I taught it as a remediation course and focusing on superheroes.
Right.
So they started realizing that they could do research on Twitter. And they started following, Marvel and DC and all these things. So I would say, for me, that was the most suggested it became, because there were still parameters if you were going to do it. I would be interested to see how that would play out.
Yeah, because I've been using it for several semesters in comp, but it's always just been kind of like, I will interact with you on Twitter. It's a nice, easy space if you want to ask me a quick question or anything. I check it pretty often. But it's usually no more than 3 or 4 students per class who will follow. So I want to institute it officially when I teach 2020 next semester, but I'm just curious.
I would think about using it in terms of participation.
Yeah.
Because I don't grade the content of a tweet.
Right.
And so it's more, it has a separate grade from participation. There's, I think it's 10% of my course. But I'm not grading on content, right? And so that makes them feel a little more interested in that conversation. And you brought up something important that's often a fear of using Twitter in the classroom, or any social media for that matter, is that you do check it often. You are always connected to it. I have a piece of technology near me pretty much all the time, and if I don't, it's very weird. And so students then have complete access, right? They can tweet at you at 12 o'clock in the morning, and if you're awake, you're probably going to respond, because that is the nature of that platform. And so thinking about ways to be like, you know what, if I don't respond to you, please don't tweet me 15 more times. Some students, if they're worried about other people seeing, they'll use the direct message feature, which really freaked me out the first time they did it, because I'm like, I feel like this is too.
That's a weird space.
That's a weird space,
Yeah.
but it works out. And so thinking about ways to negotiate that.
Mm-hmm.
So sometimes thinking, if I don't respond to you, someone else might. That kind of connects to that idea of that sense of community, which might get you to get more people to tweet.
Mm-hmm.
And then, you know how often we have these spaces in Blackboard that are supposed to be like, here, ask me a question, and it's like a community and it's a support. Nobody uses that. What I found was in Twitter, they would support each other. So if somebody was struggling, they're like, I can't get to this word count, this page count, I don't understand, I can't get to it. They became each other's cheerleaders in a very interesting way, where they're like, of course you can do it, I did it, you can do it. And I was like, look at you all being nice to each other. And I thought that was interesting because I wasn't planning that kind of community or social interaction as part of this. And that was what was so interesting when Jen presented about my class, which was weird because I'm sitting there, first of all. But she was like, the support system. And so that connected to this socialness of writing, the socialness of how the social works within a classroom, which I thought was really interesting. So for you, I would think about looking at it in terms of participation, and maybe creating that list so they're more inclined to find each other. What else?
Can you talk more about how you integrate it into class daily?
Daily class. So I integrate most often, so there's the live tweeter. So there's always somebody that has to tweet in class. But I generally incorporate it in terms of discussion. So maybe before class today, I tweeted a few quotes from what we read for today, so that would get the conversation started. I also do the assignment called the QQC, which is 2 questions and a comment. And we do that housed in Blackboard, but often they go through and select 1 question at each table, because I'm in 317, where there's these pods of people, and it's a very weird shaped classroom. But they pick 1 question, somebody tweets the question, then they respond to that question, and then we have full class discussion. And then what happens is they bring up the question and everybody starts talking, and then ideally, and sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't, everybody's sort of tweeting because they're like, oh, that's an interesting question. We don't always have a 50-minute class, so we don't always get to all the questions. So then I'll even see later on in the day, somebody has replied to one of those questions because they're like, oh, I just thought of this thing. What do you think about this? So for me, on a day-to-day basis, it's a great discussion tool. It also helps people, like, outside of what we call, the academy. Mm-hmm. It helps them see what kinds of conversations are happening. There are people for the first time tweeting to my hashtag that I have never met in my life. All of a sudden they showed up on our Twitter feed not too long ago. We were all like, who is that? Do you know them? So somebody had saw this hashtag and started seeing what was happening in that conversation and started tweeting to people. We were like,
That's weird.
what's happening? It was very weird. But it was really exciting too, because then that also validates what you're doing in the classroom in really interesting ways. It helps carry out that kind of conversation across those boundaries, which is often, I know I spend a lot of time thinking about ways to do that. Yeah.
Do you give them much, pause time when you tell them, hey, respond to this on Twitter, put this up?
I include it as part of discussion. So usually before we discuss full class, I give them about 10 to 15 minutes to tweet and discuss at their tables.
Okay.
So it all happens within that space of time. And then I pull the Twitter feed up, and we kind of go through and we look at the question, whoever's question we're talking about, we look at it. It's up on the screen while we're talking about it, in terms of also engaging the technology in your classroom space, too.
You tend to leave the feed up.
Yep. And sometimes I reply to people, and the feed is still up, so they can see me composing a tweet to them. It's great. They really like that. They like to be like, oh, what's happening?
So I don't think this would be a problem with Twitter as much, but I've been using Weebly with my students this semester. There's so many troubleshooting problems. Constant, it didn't post, right? And I've tried, I've actually, gone to bat and called the FAQ, so I translating that to Twitter though, my question is sort of, one, how do you deal with teaching the entire class to use it if they don't know how? And two, dealing with sort of troubleshooting as you go also.
So troubleshooting as you go, we'll start there. Because
Yeah.
as we all know, often the internet doesn't work in this building.
Yeah.
And that makes using Twitter really hard. And so for me, most of my students this semester are tweeting from their phones, even if they have their computer up or they have their tablets out.
Mm-hmm.
So then they can still tweet because then they're using their data plans as opposed to their internet stuff. So sometimes I've had a person where, like, today's my day to live tweet, I can't get connected to the internet, and so then we just trade. In terms of troubleshooting issues in Twitter, sometimes, or as we've found in any social media platform that because we all use probably at least one, if not more,
Mm-hmm.
there's an error, and sometimes you can figure it out. Sometimes tweets don't post. I had a student who couldn't get her tweets to post for the first 3 weeks. She would draft them, they would go in her draft. Like, it would never actually post. And it was actually a privacy setting that was set without her knowing. And the easiest way to find that out, because sometimes when you're using apps on different kinds of programs and different operating systems, the best thing to do is to pull up Twitter on a screen, on an actual computer, because you can navigate the help section better, you can navigate any of the privacy settings you may or may not have accidentally set. So that's what I would do for that. And so in terms of teaching people to use Twitter, I spend, if I teach a 2-day-a-week class, I spend about the second day of the semester giving a tutorial. Because there's always 1 or 2 students who have never used it. There's always 1 or 2 students who are like, I don't want to use it. I'm like, well, you're in this class, so we're going to use it.
One full class session?
Yep. Well, it depends. If it's a 50-minute class, probably. Because by the time you get them, since if you have a technology classroom, you're able to have everybody up on a screen, creating their Twitter accounts and following each other. So in that whole practice, you've got everybody engaged. And then you can be like, if you've never composed a tweet, let's try it, right? So it's more of a trial and error. Like, the worst thing that could happen is you say something stupid on the internet. And then we can fix it, right? Like, people say stupid things on the internet all the time, right? Like, you'd be like, look, here are my shoes. That wants to be your first tweet. And so sometimes that's also when I start doing that hashtag research. So I have everybody pull up a hashtag and see how people are talking on Twitter. So they're not necessarily contributing to the conversation yet, but they're seeing how people are. So I'll have them search a hashtag in the search bar on Twitter. And I do it from my Twitter too. So like, here we are at my Twitter, and say we're going to search for, let's do rhetoric.
What does WePost stand for?
Writing, editing, in print, and online. So I say search the word rhetoric. There are a lot of, this is people, I think. It starts with people, and then it goes through to start looking at content and looking at hashtags. You can tell it to do whichever you want, depending on what you want people to do. And so they can start seeing the kinds of people that are talking about it. They can start seeing the kinds of tweets that are happening about it. Or sometimes I have them click on one of the trending hashtags. Because often things that are connected to FSU are over there, especially in recent times. And so I'm like, well, let's click on that. What's happening there?
Yeah.
So for me, I talk a lot about, and this is sort of my pedagogy in general, is that it's a trial by error. It's low risk at first, right? You're not going to fail this class because you can't figure out Twitter right away. I always talk about how there's a learning curve. There's a learning curve to using Twitter effectively. You're not going to use a lot of hashtags at first because you're not sure how they work. So start using the class one. At least get that started, and then build from there. And then all of a sudden they're like, oh, I see now, this makes sense. And then, they may never actually be completely comfortable with it, but that's what we do. So we'll do some activities, I'll pull up whatever it is we're looking at, and then I'll pull up their first tweets and be like, see, you did it, right? Like, it happened, nothing exploded, the tweet happened,
Yeah.
right? Good job. So now let's think about ways to think about it in terms of the lens of this class.
Cool.
Yeah. So I would just dedicate a whole class or a half of the class, depending on which, like, class window of time you have.
Yeah.
Any other specific questions?
This may be in your syllabus document, but can you talk a bit more about what you say when you talk about expectations? I mean, besides like the sort of
Sure. In terms of expectations of,
like, I guess expectations about the content of their tweets, and how you help them start building a conversation.
Okay. So, because, like I said, with the learning curve, their tweets are going to start in the more personal, because that's what they know, that's what they're doing. And so I talk about that too. I'm like, so if you're still tweeting a lot about, you know, what you had for breakfast and things like that, you will slowly start tweeting more about class because you've learned more in class. So my expectation of content goes along with the path of the class. So the more you know, the more your tweets are going to reflect what you know. So if we're in, say, an FYC class and we're talking a lot about rhetorical analysis or the rhetorical appeals, you might have a very sort of beginning understanding of that. And then as we get through that project, your tweets about those sorts of concepts are going to become much more clear and much more like you believe you deserve to make those claims. It's the same idea of believing you get to be in conversation with the sources you're citing in your text as opposed to appealing to those texts as authorities. Mm-hmm. And so I kind of, my expectation increases as the semester does. So often there'll be tweets that are like not at all related, although if they're thinking rhetorically, they can make an argument for it early on. That's also why you hashtag 10 of the 15, or, you know, however many tweets I decide to require for the semester, so that at least your goal at first is to get 10 that are definitely connected to class, and then they start naturally creeping into those other 5. It's just like when we start reading theory and we're like, this is never going to connect out into the real world. I am probably never going to just talk about Burke, right? And then all of a sudden you're like, you know, having dinner and you start talking about Burke and you're like, oh my God, I'm crazy. It gives him a space for that crazy to take place. So it definitely aligns with the more you know, the more your tweets should reflect that. And they seem to appreciate it because it gives them some time to get footing.
I'm on Twitter.
Oh, yay, Twitter! So we have about 5 minutes till the workshop itself is over. If you want, I can go ahead and share. I put all of this stuff on Google Drive to make it easy for sharing. Like I have a folder called Twittering. And hi.
Hi, I was just wondering, do you know where the dean of the English department is located? Do you know his office?
It would be up on the 4th floor.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah. I don't know, we have the chair of the English department, but anyway. And so you can go ahead and start maybe drafting sections. I'll go ahead and pull up my syllabus because that's a space that I really use when I talk about technology. I'm using my WePo syllabus, but I should let you know that the last time I taught FYC, it was essentially like a baby writing, editing, and print and online class. So the kinds of expectations are pretty transferable for an FYC class. But you're teaching WePo.
Yeah, I would love to get this from you.
You got
I
it.
want some examples.
So let me scroll down here. So like I have a brief little blurb about it. Did I already? I did. I missed the civility clause. Those are, no I didn't. Apparently I can't navigate my own syllabus, it turns out.
Yeah, happens to me all the time. So much.
So
stuff.
like even, you know, when you have required texts and things like that, I list all of the things they're going to have. These are the expectations. So that they know this is not really optional. This is a part of the course. It's going to be threaded through the course. Major assignments, class discussion. There's a little bit bigger blurb about what it is I'm expecting Twitter to do. Plus, I have the assignment sheet. I like to give you all sorts of potential ways to understand the why behind what I do. Late work attendance. Computer access privilege. There we go. Yeah, and so this is a start into that conversation, right? I know you're going to text, right? Like I'm fully aware you're going to have technology and you're going to use it, not just for this class. But know that A, you don't want me to be texting my friends the whole time I have my phone out. And it's sometimes it's a real draw, right? Sometimes that group text that I have, I've got a whole bunch of texts waiting for me, and I'm like, man, I wish I could go and look what it says. So it's, you know, practicing moderation. We talk about that. I guess this is really close. This was a place where I didn't necessarily have it addressing use of social media until the moment where I got to deal with the hashtag #AskBreath in class, regarding to really grotesque things one might connect to the idea of #AskBreath, and very derogatory issues. But anyway, that's when I was like, oh, okay, so now this kind of needs to be really, really addressed in the civility statement.